everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to be talking about Q3 and giving you my Q3 stats. It kind of seems like I've done this just yesterday for Q2. That is, of course, because I was super late with my Q2 stats, and in the meantime I've been on like 2 short holidays, so I kind of feel like time has flown by since then. But in any case, let's just talk about the stats and where we are at this point in time. Q3 will definitely be like the worst stats that I have for this year so far, but it's actually mainly down to one month in particular, the month of July. July is basically when I had my sort of like burnout from the speed that I'd gone through my reading in the first half of the year, and the moment in which I kind of had to take a step back, reset, and just be like, okay, I cannot keep up with this pace, I need to slow down a little bit and make sure that aside from reading a whole lot, I'm also doing other things. I'm also making more time for other stuff. So the month of July, for example, I only read 3 books. So in terms of my statistics, that really was like okay, did I even read that month? Regardless, I'm not gonna like punish myself for that or beat myself up for that. I definitely don't want reading to be all about the numbers. So I'm definitely happy that I was able to just like listen to my body, listen to my mental state, and just take a step back. But so basically, let's just go over my main goals. I will give you 2 numbers for all of these goals. I will give you the Q3 specific stats, so whatever I got read within the months of July, August, and September, and then also the year-to-date stats. So the first one is the Goodreads amount of books that I read. This isn't really an important goal for me. As I indicated earlier, I don't want it to be all about the numbers, and so I do have a Goodreads goal, but it's basically a very manageable one. Basically already achieved it like at the midway point of the year. But so in Q3 I read 17 books, which is the lowest amount of books that I have read in a quarter this year. So 17 out of my goal of 52, but as I just indicated, I had already reached my goal. So at this point in time, I've read 72 books out of the 52 that I had committed to. Part of me wants to kind of get to the 100 books, and in that sense, I am behind schedule, but I also don't want to sacrifice my mental health for it. So if it doesn't end up happening, then I'll be perfectly fine with whatever number I end up getting to. Secondly, like my main goal, my most important focus for this reading year is trying to make headway in these shelves. This has been my goal for past year as well. It will be my goal next year as well. And so I'm trying to reach 0 TBR. I don't want to reach it yet in 2021 because that just isn't feasible with the amount of books that I read and the fact that I want to buy books as well. But I want to get to under 40. In these 3 months, I've definitely made like the least progress when it comes to that. So I've reduced the number of physical books on my TBR by 6. Now I need to get to an average of 11-12, so I definitely didn't get the average that I needed to. And in the first 2 quarters of the year, I basically just hit that average. I didn't really go over too much, meaning that I'm currently somewhat behind schedule in order to get to that particular goal. So I kind of need to crunch it up a little bit in the last quarter of the year. So we'll have to see whether that is feasible or not. In total, throughout the year, that means that I have reduced my physical TBR by 29 books. And so at this point in time, I have 55 books left on my physical TBR, and as I said, I want to get under 40. Next up, my secondary main goal, and actually the one goal that I did like the best on in Q3 is reading fantasy. So I am a fantasy and literary fiction channel. That's always the way that I kind of see myself. But in the first few years in which I was producing content, I always felt like I was putting fantasy on the back burner. Like fantasy was a type of thing that I always felt like I didn't have time for. I always felt like because of my reading pace, reading fantasy just took so much of my reading time that, I could read so much more literary fiction at the same time. And so as a result, I was never prioritizing the fantasy. And this year I definitely wanted to make sure that I did that. Now I'm going to look at this from 2 perspectives. I'm going to look at it based on the amount of books that I've read within the genre, and then I'm also going to look at the page count. But actually, for Q3, there isn't, like, I reached my goal in both versions. So in Q3, 52.9% of what I read book-wise were fantasy books, meaning over half of the books that I read were fantasy books. When we look at page count, that number goes up. 59% of all pages that I read are fantasy books. So In Q3, I managed that goal. Half of what I've read has been fantasy within Q3. When it comes to the total amount, we do see that the distinction between books and pages. So when it comes to the overall books that I read in 2021, 45.8% of them have been fantasy. So I'm under the halfway mark there, but I'm pretty close to being at the 50%, especially considering the next statistics, which is in terms of page count, 58.7% of all pages that I've read have been in fantasy books, meaning more than half of what I read is actually fantasy, because page count is a little bit more of a reliable source in that sense, because fantasy books tend to be on the longer side. And since I've been reading like bigger fantasy books, I've also often reached for like shorter literary fiction works in order to not have too many big books on my TBR. So in that sense, I definitely think that even when we look at the year to date, I could say that this is definitely a success so far. So these are kind of like the big goals of my channel. These are the things that I mainly wanted to focus on this year. But I also, as every year, created a list of 12 books that I wanted to get around to in 2021. Now, this year I made this very visible. I made this very much a feasible goal, and I also put like rewards in place. And I can definitely see the impact of that. At the end of Q2, I'd read 7 out of the 12 books within that list. I read a further 2 out of that list, so I'm at 9 out of 12 at this point in time, which is perfectly on track. And actually, out of the 3 remaining books, I already started 2 other books. I actually am a little bit late. I should have finished one of them in September, but I wasn't able to finish it within September. But so I'm currently reading 2 out of the 3 remaining books, and the third one is actually scheduled for next month. So that shouldn't be a problem at all. I'm definitely going to be able to manage that. Secondly, I also had like a list of classics I wanted to get to this year. I will say that this wasn't a goal that I didn't put too much importance on. I also made the rewards a little bit less appealing for that particular goal. So it isn't as enticing for me to read one of the books off of that list as it is to read one of the books off of the 12 books for 2021 list, for example. But I read a further 1 book out of those 6, which means that in total I've read 4 of the 6 books on that list, meaning that I'm more or less on track with that. But I will say, for those 2 remaining books, one of them is on my October TBR and is definitely getting read, but the other one, I don't know. I don't know whether it's happening because I'm not really drawn to the book anymore at this point in time. So I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. It is very likely that I actually won't be completing this goal, but I also won't necessarily hate myself for it, and 5 out of 6 will still be a very great number. Now, those rewards and incentives that I've been talking about in the previous section, they actually link to a book buying credit system that I have. So for the books that I read, I get credits, and with those credits, I can buy books. Now, of course, as I indicated, my main goal is to get to a 0 TBR. So buying books is counterintuitive or is counterproductive. If I buy books, that means that I have to read more books in order to get my TBR down. So I want to avoid that. And that is also a big factor to what went wrong in Q3. Because in Q3, I purchased 6 more books. So I added 6 books to the overall TBR. That's definitely the highest number of books that I've added to my TBR so far in a single quarter. I would definitely say that one of the months in particular was responsible for that, in which I added about like 5 books to my TBR. So yeah, not particularly great. So the month of July in that sense was a month in which I read almost nothing and added way too many books to my TBR. But that also means that overall, in the course of this year so far, I have added 16 books to my TBR. And yeah, that is a little bit higher than I would have liked it to be, I think, at this point in time. Would like to curb that expenditure a little bit more in the final quarter. I'm definitely going to need to if I still want to get around to my TBR goal, to my 0 TBR goal. And then in terms of what I read out of those, so out of those 6 that I've added to my TBR in the last few months, I have already read 3 of them. Those were actually the 3 that I knew from the beginning of the year. I'm going to have to buy them in the month of July. But the 3 others that I added to my TBR in Q3, I haven't been able to get around to. And I will also say that they aren't scheduled on any TBR yet, so that's also a problem because before the end of the year, I want to have finished all of them. And that being said, at this point in time, out of the 16 books that I've added to my TBR in 2021 so far, I have read 12. So I still have to make my way through 4 of them. And of course, I will probably still be buying some. I have a pre-order scheduled, for example, for November. I did already buy a book in the beginning of October, so yeah, I'm starting to get a little bit stressed about my goal of getting under 40 books, but you know, we'll just have to see. We'll just have to power through, and if I don't make it, then you know, it's just gonna be a little bit longer until I get to that 0 TBR. But you know, I would like to get to it sooner because this process has taken so long already. And I mean, I knew from the get-go it was gonna take long. I think when I started this whole process, I was like over 150 books on my physical TBR that I hadn't read yet. So I knew it was gonna take me time and take me decisions of cutting down that TBR in order to get to a lower, more acceptable number. And then when I made that decision to get to 0 TBR, I expected it to take 2 years, but somewhere along the line, I've gotten excited about the idea that it might take me less than 2 years, but at this point in time, I'm starting to think maybe I need to accept the fact that slow and steady wins the race, and maybe I need to give myself the entirety of 2022 to get around to the 0 TBR, but we'll have to see, because part of me still wants to do it quicker than that, but we'll have to see what ends up happening in final quarter of this year. Q4, are you going to save things, or are you going to make me be a little bit more practical in my expectations? But so yeah, that is it for my stats for Q3. When it comes to more stats about what I specifically have been reading, then you know, that'll come at the end of the year. But as has been the case in the other quarterly updates for my reading, I have also gone through my best book of the quarter and my worst book of the quarter. My best book of the quarter, I need to go and grab it because I wanted it in my background during this video. But so my best book of the quarter is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is actually the first book I read this quarter as well. So also indicating that even though I only read 3 books in the month of July still was a great one because my runner-up kinda is also from that same month. So She Who Became the Sun is a Chinese-inspired historical fantasy series. It is quite light on the fantasy elements, but they are definitely there. It's kind of marketed as Mulan meets Song for Achilles. However, you know, you need to take that very basically. The Mulan premise is basically the fact that we are following a protagonist who is born as a woman and who dresses up as a man. Now in this case we are following our protagonist called Ju. In the beginning we only know her by her family name Ju. However, through circumstances she takes over her brother's identity and she takes on the name of Ju Chongpa. And Ju Chongpa is actually the founder of the Ming Dynasty. Through this book we will be exploring a lot of sort of like gender identity and gender dynamics. Our protagonist isn't just a girl who dresses up as a boy, she's a girl who from an early age onward goes through life as a boy, and her relationship to her gender becomes very complex. She doesn't feel like a girl pretending to be a boy. She does not feel like a boy trapped in a girl's body. She feels like she is something other. She isn't just a girl or a boy, she's something different altogether. And I found that to be a very interesting take on the whole sort of like gender bent genre. You know, there are a whole lot of retellings that put a gender bent twist on the original story. You know, they put a female character in the role that a male character has originally inhabited. But I thought it was so interesting to see what this gender bent novel did and its exploration of gender identity. I thought it lent itself so well to a discussion like that it's just a surprise that it hasn't happened before, basically. But so aside from that, there's just a whole lot more to dive into. This is very much war-centric, so if you don't really like war fantasy, do know that going into it there is a lot of war taking place within the story. I think it is a funny story as well. Our character Ju has this very fun sense of humor. Aside from that, it's very much entrenched in the Chinese culture. A lot of aspects to this aren't really explained to the Western reader, or at least their cultural significance or cultural background isn't really explained to the Western reader, meaning that it has like a deeper layer for people who are a little bit more acquainted with Chinese culture. And you know, I loved it from start to finish. I'm so looking forward to the sequel in this duology, and will definitely want to be rereading this one before that. And you know, for my worst book of the quarter, I feel kind of bad doing this, but I'm gonna have to mention A NetGalley Arc. There are 2 books that I DNF'd in this quarter. However, I feel like the reason why I DNF'd them is more like they weren't doing a whole lot for me personally, but I also felt like they were decent books. I was just not in the mood for them. Whereas with the NetGalley art, it was more a case of me feeling like the concept was interesting, but that the execution didn't really work all that well for me. So I'm talking here about Meaty Pleasures by Monica Levin. So I was granted access to this through NetGalley, and I'm very grateful for that. It is a translated book from Spanish. Definitely want to be reading more translated fiction. It's probably going to be my 2022 reading goal. And so I was really happy to take this opportunity. It is a short story collection, and that is part of the problem, of course, with short story collections. You always have stronger works and weaker works, or at least most of the time when I read a short story collection, I'm never really in love with all of the stories within this. But in this case, like the stories that I enjoyed, the stories that I appreciated or found to be very interesting were rare exceptions. The majority of the stories I didn't really see their point, or why they were included, or what the author was trying to discuss through the short story. These short stories were described as being a sort of blend of desire and the cruelty of life, and in the best instances I definitely saw that, and I like that sort of like dark twist on romance, dark twist on people seeking connection, people desiring one another. And so in the best tales that was done successfully. In the worst cases, it just made me wonder, where is the sort of like darker side to this romance story, or what is the point, or it didn't really have a satisfying conclusion. It didn't seem to be going anywhere. And so sadly for me personally, that collection really didn't work all that well. And if it hadn't been a NetGalley arc, I don't think that I would have completed it. I think I would have probably given up after like the first 3 short stories, sadly. But so yeah, that is it for my Q3 wrap up. As I indicated earlier, I will have more specific stats at the end of the year about my total reading year, but I hope you already enjoyed these few stats that I threw your way in this particular video. Let me know what your favorite book of Q3 has been. What have you been reading? And was it a good quarter overall, or have you been struggling as I have? So hope you enjoyed this video, and see you guys for a future one. Bye!